Hello, welcome to the penultimate video in this series on HIPPO, the performance profiling, monitoring and capacity planning solution for Informatica. Today we're going to look at the two submenus within HIPPO. We're going to look at the workflow submenu and the task submenu. Now, as you'll see on the left hand side of the HIPPO chart here, neither of these menu options are available. They are contextual and are available whenever you see a session or a workflow name on a HIPPO chart. As soon as you click on that session or workflow name, then the appropriate menu option appears. So let me show you what I'm talking about. We click on resources and then CPU, and we then scroll down and we find our top workflows by CPU time, and then click on one of the workflows. Then you'll notice that a new menu option has appeared on the left hand side called workflow, and it has three submenu topics. It has execution, workflow trends and history. So this is entirely contextual. You have to have drilled down into a workflow for this to appear. Now, the options available for workflow analysis are pretty straightforward, so I can cover them quite quickly before we move on to the task menu option. Let's look at what we see here. So by default we come into the workflow execution screen, and we see in the top here a banner which tells us immediately what the status of this workflow is. It tells us whether it succeeded, whether it failed. It tells us when it executed, which date and which time, and the duration of that execution. It also gives us a repository and the folder that the workflow comes from. So if you're a support analyst, this is a very quick way to get all of the salient facts that you need if you're perhaps investigating some issue in an overnight batch. Okay, what do we have next? Next we have a chart with tasks by elapsed time. All of the tasks within the workflow are displayed here. We get the task type, the duration of each task, information about source rows, rejected rows, and the overall size of the source data that we've processed. Same for target rows, and we get the overall aggregate cache size for that task. Just to prove that we can drill down anywhere within HIPPO into a contextual submenu, if I click on the individual task name, then as you'll see on the left hand side of the screen, the contextual submenu for task appears with each of the five submenu options there. But let me scroll back to workflow, which is what we're concerned with here. So that's our tasks by, that's the elapsed time information, also the volumetrics for data for each of the tasks within the workflow. What do we also see? Well, we see workflow CPU time. This is an aggregate score for the use of CPU in seconds over the time which this workflow has run for. So as you can see, as I scroll over with my mouse on each of the sample points, we get the date and time of the sample point, and we get the aggregate amount of CPU seconds used up to that point in time. In this case it was 16 CPU seconds up until 01:16:13. Then it rose to 28 CPU seconds at 01:17:13, and so on, over the course of the execution until we peaked out at 40 CPU seconds. Next we have workflow memory usage, and this is a point in time score, it's not an aggregate. So we have 76 megabytes used at the first sample point, 98 at the next, 98 again, 98 again, 98, and then dropping down to the end of the execution at 82 megabytes in terms of memory usage. So that's the profile of the individual execution of this workflow. What else do we have available to us? Well, we have workflow trends. And workflow trends gives us, for this individual workflow, all of the executions which have occurred during the date and time range of our analysis. So here we're looking at the last 24 hours. So these are all of the executions of the workflow mortgage resync over that 24-hour period. This one here is our last one. This is the one that we started out with, and we're seeing all of the previous executions so that we can get a feel for the following metrics: workflow elapsed time, workflow CPU time, workflow throughput, workflow in rows processed, and workflow in terms of cache size. So you can see that workflow in terms of cache size has stayed constant during its execution. The only peak that we can see here is that in this final execution, CPU time peaked up at 152 CPU seconds. So that's quite interesting, and it's something that we would need to drill down into the individual tasks within the workflow to find out a little bit more about. And that's what we'll do in the next session, which deals with the contextual task menu. So more about that to follow. So what we have here is a profile of the trends of this workflow over the period of our analysis. We can obviously take a wider look at this. We can analyse over a week, and we can get a much wider perspective in terms of the performance of this individual workflow. Finally, we have history. History allows us to look at any historical execution of this workflow over our chosen date and time range. It's a quick way of navigating into one of those individual executions that we saw in the previous workflow trends screen. So we can click on it and we can drill down into that individual execution, and again we can profile it. Wherever you see a workflow name, you can click on it and HIPPO will take you down into this menu and you can analyse that individual execution. Next up, we're going to look at the task contextual menu, which has 5 sub-menu options, and there's quite a bit more detail there, so hope you can join me then. Thank you.